So this is the third Sunday of Advent. The theme of this Sunday is the Sunday of joy, as we recognize the joy that was birthed into the world. And I've told you about my family, and we have lots of Christmas traditions. I'm going to talk about one today, and I'm going to talk about another. We've got a whole list, and I look back retrospectively, and I'm just so grateful for all the traditions that my parents put in place, because it just such a special season. Before I talk about the tradition I want to today, let's read from Luke chapter 2, words that you have already heard a bit this morning. This is Luke 2, 1 through 7. It says, "In those days a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged, and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver the child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn." Now this is interesting. Keep that on there for just a second, because my version says inn, and that version right there says guest room. And I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to get to my, that kind of threw me off, but it's something that I wanted to mention later. So the tradition I'm talking about this week is one that is really, really near and dear to me, and that is the tradition of putting out a nativity scene. For me, the Advent season didn't start in our home until we put out our nativity scene. And the one that I remember every year putting out was just a simple carved, dark stained wood, colorless nativity scene. That we would put all sorts of decorations out, but it didn't really start until we put that nativity. A couple little characters. We have one now that has, I don't know, probably several different characters that you can put in different places if you want, I guess, as you imagine what it looked like. But I also have this one that was handed down to me from my grandparents, and so it's really special to me. It's a little fancier than the one that I grew up with. This one has a little bit of gold trim and highlights, and Jesus there has a gold halo behind him. I would invite you to come look at it after the service. It's a little more ornate than the one I grew up with, but there's just something about nativity scenes that are really special, that you see, and I don't know, for me now there's a sense of nostalgia to it. It just brings you to the Christmas season. I remember one year we were putting up all of our Christmas decorations. It was at one of our, at a house we lived in Texas that had kind of a blank slate of an exterior wall. We've got one of those little nativity scenes, well, little, it's not, it's all relative, I guess. It's about this big that you can put on your front lawn. And I'll never forget the first year I got a spotlight to go on that nativity scene. And at first it was unintentional, but then when I saw what it did, I got excited about it. I put that spotlight, and it cast this huge shadow of the nativity scene on the side of our house. It took it to the next level. And I remember Megan saying, "Don't you think that's a little big?" I was like, hey, if anybody's going to have a big nativity scene, it's got to be the pastor, right? So this was the pastor's house. But when we go back to it, we actually look at things like this. So you go, I wonder if the nativity scenes that we see and that we set up and that we have fun with are really an accurate display of what happened on that Christmas morning. And we've talked about the power and glory of Christmas and the pressure of all these images you see in Christmas, and the reality that maybe that first Christmas wasn't as beautiful and glorious as we paint it, but yet its power was different. One of those things that we recognize in the scriptures is that we say, well, there's no room for him in the inn. And I remember picturing like a hotel, and they were trying to get a room at a hotel, and more accurately, the translation for inn could be guest room. And we picture this manger scene being way out in a field maybe, but more likely scholars tell us that manger was was probably connected to somebody's house. And so there are a lot of dynamics that we don't really realize, or maybe you've heard these before, but we often gloss over when we set up our gold-layered nativity scenes. Or I think about, again, those beasts that surrounded the birth of Jesus. I think about the mess that must have been, in many different regards, there on that first Christmas. And when we stop to pause and consider the reality of Emmanuel, I don't know about you, but it actually kind of gives me hope. Because if the God of all creation can show up in the midst of a real life situation with real people, with a real mess and real circumstances, then that God can still show up to you and me today. And the power of Christmas in this grandiose picture of the I don't know, I was going to say the Sistine Chapel type paintings of what the Nativity looked like, but it's in the more accurate reality that the Creator showed up in the midst of our lives. The power of Christmas is upside down, that the Creator, the one who created you, and now like I say it in every benediction, knows you better than you know yourself, has not stopped showing up. Emmanuel, God with us, no matter what your mess looks like, that's exactly where God shows up. Be reminded that the power of Christmas is real. And it arrives in the midst of our mess. And that's why we can have joy. But I would do a disservice if I didn't say that still gives me a sense of peace. That when I set up the nativity scene, I can still step back and be reminded that even though I don't know if Mary and Joseph had gold sparkles on their robes, there's just something about the Christmas season and setting up nativity scenes that allows me and reminds me to pause and to find joy no matter what I'm going through. Amen? Amen. Let's continue with our program this morning.